Welcome to today's podcast where we're going to explore the complex history of American involvement in Cuba's economy and how Cubans began to resist foreign control. They resented it after a while, and this led to some radical changes. This story is central to understanding the tensions that led to the Cuban Revolution and has shaped Cuban-American relations for decades. From the late 19th through the mid-20th century, American business dominated Cuba's economy. The Platt Amendment gave the U.S. control over Cuban affairs, allowing American companies to expand. They began to control sugar plantations, railroads, and utilities. By the 1920s, U.S. corporations owned two-thirds of Cuba's farmland and controlled key industries. This economic dominance benefited American investors, but for many Cubans it meant poverty and dependence on foreign interests. There were some Cubans who benefited from this, but wages for Cuban workers remained low, and profits were funneled out of the country, reinforcing inequality. During Spanish rule, many Cubans had suffered from the rigid Spanish class system, and they were slaves who were hoping to benefit from upward mobility after independence. Luis A. Perez, Jr. argues that U.S. economic control created a form of neocolonial dependency, keeping Cuba politically sovereign but financially subjugated. Resistance to U.S. influence grew in the 1930s and 1940s as labor strikes and protests erupted across the country. Cuban intellectuals such as Eduardo Chivas and the Ortodoxo Party criticized government corruption and U.S. economic control. In a 1947 radio broadcast, Chivas warned, "Cuba's wealth is in foreign hands, and we must take back our nation's future," a sentiment that resounded with many Cubans. In the 1940s, Cuba did adopt a progressive constitution that aimed to limit foreign corporate influence, but enforcement was weak under leaders like Fulgencio Batista, who remained closely tied to U.S. interests. By the 1950s, frustration reached a boiling point. Fidel Castro and the July 26 movement targeted American-owned businesses, organizing attacks on sugar mills and utilities. One of the most brazen and symbolic acts of defiance came in 1959 when Castro's government nationalized U.S.-owned companies, seizing industries that had dominated Cuba for decades. Historian Julia E. Swig describes this as a calculated move to dismantle foreign economic control. This further solidified Cuba's break from the U.S. and led to the economic embargo that remains in place until today. And this is how one of the United States' closest neighbors and friends became an enemy 90 miles across the water. That's all for today's podcast. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned for more deep dives into the past.